frozen platform, 5 terrified children, and a wedding that was already collapsing. This was the Christmas Eve that would change everything, and Levi Prentice did not even know her name yet. He was still holding his one traveling case in both hands, still searching the crowd for the woman whose letters had carried him 2,000 miles, when he understood, all at once, in the particular way a man understands a thing right before it ruins him, that no one on that platform had been expecting him at all. I have gathered stories from every stretch of this frontier, and I promise you, few of them start this hard and this fast. Stay with me to the end, because this one earns it. The whole road from a frozen depot in the Wyoming territory to a home nobody thought could be rebuilt. The writer Laura Ingalls Wilder, who knew a thing or two about winters that tried to break a family before they broke the soil, once put it plainer than I ever could. In real life, real difficulties must be met and faced and dealt with, somehow, at some cost, she wrote. Nella Hart had been paying that cost alone for 2 winters running by the time this story finds her. So let's go back to the beginning, out past the timberline, to the Two Elk ranch and the woman who was holding it together with her bare hands. Nella Hart was 33 years old in the December of 1886, and she had been running cattle on her own land since her husband Daniel was thrown from a green horse during a spring squall and dragged 40 yards before the animal finally stopped. It had taken 11 days for him to die of it, which was 11 days longer than anyone expected, and not nearly long enough for Nella to prepare for what came after. What came after was 5 children under 13, 6,000 acres of range that did not care whose hands worked it, and a debt on the books that Daniel had never once mentioned to her because he had believed, right up until the horse threw him, that he had another season to fix it quietly on his own. She had not folded. That was the first thing anyone in Coldwater Crossing would volunteer about Nella Hart. Usually with a kind of grudging respect they weren't entirely comfortable extending to a woman who ran her own brand and carried her own rifle. She rode the fence lines herself. She broke her own horses, badly at first and then well. She kept the barn tight and the water troughs clear of ice, through 2 brutal winters, because she understood, in the marrow-deep way a rancher understands such things, that a family with hungry cattle was a family with nothing at all. What had slipped in those 2 years was everything that lived inside the house rather than outside it. The woodpile ran low more often than it should have. A shutter had come loose on the east window in October and stayed loose. There was a crack in the front step that nobody had time to fix properly, so it had been packed with dirt instead and left to wait for a spring that kept not arriving. Her oldest, Hazel, was 13 that winter, sharp-eyed and quietly furious at a world that had taken her father and then demanded her mother become twice the person she used to be. Hazel had watched Nella come in from the range each evening gray with exhaustion, eat standing up because sitting felt like giving in, and fall asleep some nights still wearing her boots. She had watched it for 2 years, and somewhere in the autumn of the second year, she had decided she was done watching. It started, as these things often do, with an advertisement Hazel found folded inside a supply catalog that came out to the ranch in September. A rancher 2 counties over, writing plainly, without embellishment, looking for a wife capable of running a cattle operation with him. Hazel had read the notice 3 times, and thought, with the particular clarity of a child who has taken on too much responsibility too young, that if a stranger could advertise for a wife who could work, then surely someone out there was advertising to be found. She did not tell her mother. She wrote her own notice instead. In careful adult handwriting she had practiced for a week, describing a widow of good character, running a Wyoming cattle range with 5 children, seeking a capable and honest man, unafraid of hard work or a full house. Serious inquiries only, the line struck her, as the truest one in the whole advertisement, so she kept it. She mailed it under her mother's name and did not sleep well for a month, waiting to see if anyone would answer, and half hoping no one would. Someone did. His name was Levi Prentice, and he was 29 years old, and he had spent most of his adult life keeping other people's ledgers in a dry goods store in Springfield, Ohio, because it was the only work anyone had ever offered him, and because he had never had the nerve, or the reason, to look for anything else. His mother had died when he was 6. His father had left not long after, and never come back. He had been raised by an aunt who kept a tidy house and a tight budget, and loved him in the practical, unsentimental way of a woman who had raised herself and expected the same of everyone in her care. She had passed the previous spring, and Levi had woken up the following morning in a house that was suddenly entirely his and entirely empty, and understood for the first time in his life exactly how alone a person could be while still being surrounded by other people's shelves of goods every single day. He wrote back to the notice because something in it had cut through the careful nothing of his days. He was honest in his letter, plainer than he had meant to be. His letter was plain: no land, little saved, no family left to speak of. He was not afraid of children or of work, he wrote, and he had spent his whole life being useful to other people without ever once feeling necessary to any of them. The letters that came back, 4 of them over as many months, were warm without being soft, careful without being cold, written in a hand that struck him as older than he would have guessed, and wiser than most people managed. One line from the 3rd letter stayed with him longer than any of the others. "I don't know if I remember how to want someone near again," it read, "but I think I would like to try, if you are willing." He read that line so many times the paper wore soft at the fold. He sold what little he had that was worth selling, kept only what fit in one traveling case, and bought a single one-way ticket west, because somewhere in the writing back and forth, he had quietly decided he would not be needing a return one. The train climbed out of the flat country and into the high, hard beauty of the Wyoming range, and Levi Prentice watched the mountains rise through frost-fogged glass and let himself, for the first time in a very long while, imagine a life that had a person in it who was glad he'd come. Nella had no idea any of this had happened. She rode into Coldwater Crossing that Christmas Eve afternoon, for the ordinary reasons a rancher rides into town in December, to collect the mail and settle an account at the feed store before the roads froze over for good. And she had 5 children in tow, only because leaving them home alone on Christmas Eve had felt like one deprivation too many for a family that had already lost so much. She had no reason at all to expect the scene she stepped into on the depot platform, where a stranger in a good but travel-worn coat was standing with a case in both hands, scanning the small gathered crowd with an expression of dawning, terrible confusion, and where her own 5 children were already clustered together at the edge of the platform, wearing the particular stillness of people who know exactly what is about to go wrong. It was the station master, meaning no harm and understanding nothing, who broke it wide open. "Mrs. Hart!" He waved her over before she'd even set her basket down. "This fellow's been asking after you. Says you two have an understanding." The platform went very quiet. Levi Prentice turned, and for one long, suspended moment he simply looked at her. A woman in a worn canvas coat with a rifle scabbard at her saddle, and an expression that was rapidly sliding from confusion into something colder, and understood, the way a man understands a fall the instant his boot finds no ground, that whatever he had built in his mind for the last 4 months had just come apart in front of a dozen strangers. "I never wrote you a letter in my life." Nella's voice was not a shout. It was worse than a shout, level and flat and final, the voice of a woman deciding in real time how much of her humiliation she was willing to let the whole town of Coldwater Crossing witness. Her eyes moved past him to the 5 children standing frozen at the platform's edge, and something in her face changed entirely as the shape of it arrived all at once. Hazel stepped forward before anyone else could. She was 13 and she had rehearsed this 100 times in her head over 4 months, and none of the rehearsals had prepared her for how small her own voice would sound in the open cold. "Mama!" Hazel's chin came up, her voice unsteady but refusing to break. "I need you to let me finish before you decide anything. It's my fault, all of it, mine and the others. We wrote the letters. We wrote them as you, because," Hazel's voice cracked once and she pushed through it, "because we watched you fall asleep in your boots for 2 winters, and nobody was coming to help, and I didn't know what else to do." The wind moved between them, and nobody on that platform made a sound for what felt like a very long time. Levi stood with his case still in both hands, watching a scene he had no right to be part of, and no way now to leave gracefully, understanding with a sick, sinking certainty that the woman standing 8 feet away had been ambushed by her own children exactly as thoroughly as he had been deceived by them, and that whatever came next was entirely and rightfully hers to decide. Nella looked at the five of them for a long moment. Hazel with her chin up and her eyes dry, Toby staring hard at his boots, Clara watchful and still, Bennett caught somewhere between guilt and hope, and little Eli, only 4, already starting to cry without quite understanding why. Then she looked at Levi Prentice, really looked at him, at the honest, mortified face of a man who so plainly had not known any of this either. "How far did you come?" Levi set his case down at his feet before answering. 600 miles, give or take." She was quiet another moment. Then she picked up her carpet bag from where she'd set it down. "It's Christmas Eve, and it's 15 degrees, and I am not putting a man who came 600 miles in good faith back on a train tonight, whatever else my children have done. You'll take supper at the ranch and a bed for the night. Past that, I'm making no promises to anyone, including myself." She turned toward the wagon without waiting to see if he'd follow, and the 5 children fell into step behind her one by one, like ducklings that had run out of other options. The ranch, when the wagon finally came around the last bend of the road, was not what Levi had pictured in 4 months of careful letter writing. The barn stood square and well kept, fences mended, water trough clear of ice, everything a working cattlewoman's hands could reach. The house was a different story. A shutter hung loose on one hinge. The wood pile beside the door was low for December. A crack ran across the front step, packed with dirt and left to wait. Levi understood, looking at it, exactly where 2 years of a woman's exhausted strength had been spent, and exactly what it had cost to spend it there instead of here. Inside, the cabin smelled of banked wood smoke, and old coffee, and the particular disorder of a household run by children doing an adult's work without quite enough hours in the day to finish it. Hazel showed him to a narrow room at the end of the hall, sheets made up that morning. "Before we knew," her voice dropped, "before we knew if you'd even still want to come, after the platform." Levi set his case down and did not say anything for a moment, because there was a great deal to say, and none of it seemed like it belonged to him yet. He found the kitchen instead. Nella had gone back out to check the stock before dark, the way she always did, and the younger children were scattered through the house in the restless, unsettled way of children who did not yet know what to do with a strange man standing in their kitchen. Bennett, 5 years old and entirely without guile, appeared in the doorway holding half a biscuit. "Are you going to cook supper?" "Nobody's cooked supper since Mama left for town." "I might, if somebody shows me where the flour is kept." He made what he could from what he found: salt pork and beans soaked quick in hot water, cornbread from a tin of meal that had clearly not been touched in some time, and a small pan of dried apples he found pushed to the back of the pantry, sweetened with the last of a cinnamon stick. It was not fancy. It was the first hot meal the Hart household had eaten together in longer than any of them wanted to admit, and when Nella came in from the barn, cold through and expecting nothing, she stopped in the doorway at the smell of it and did not immediately have anything to say. "You didn't have to do that." Nella's tone wasn't quite a thank you, and wasn't quite a question either. "I'm aware. It seemed like the decent thing, under the circumstances." They sat down together for the first time that evening, all 6 of them and the stranger the children had summoned, and it was Toby, 10 years old and trying hard to look like nothing bothered him, who broke the careful quiet over supper. "It's Christmas Eve. Papa always put oranges in the stockings." "We don't have stockings out." The table went very still. Nella's fork stopped moving. But what came next was not what Levi had braced for. She set the fork down and looked at her son directly. "You're right, he did. I'm sorry about the stockings this year." When Toby shrugged like it didn't matter, she pressed on. "It's not fine. But we get through it anyway." Then, because Bennett could never resist filling a silence, he announced that Mama had tried baking Christmas cookies once, the winter Papa first got sick, and burned every single one of them black. A short, startled laugh broke out of Nella before she could stop it, the first real one Levi had heard from her. "They were terrible. Don't let anyone tell you different." The whole table laughed, even Hazel, even little Eli, who laughed simply because everyone else was laughing, and for one unguarded minute, the room felt like something that might, eventually, be able to heal. Later, after the children were down, Levi found Nella alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her. He sat across from her, because leaving unsaid what needed saying felt like its own kind of cowardice. I need to say this plainly, because I'm not skilled at saying difficult things well. What your children did was wrong, and I understand entirely if you want me gone by morning. I don't have land of my own. I don't have much saved. I'm not certain what use I am to a woman who's already built all of this without a single soul helping her. Nella studied him for a long moment across the table. She's 13. She did the best she knew how with what little she had. She wrote that you were serious, decent, and hardworking. Was any of that untrue? No, it wasn't. I'm not asking you to marry me tonight. I'm asking if there's reason enough for you to stay through Christmas. That's the whole of the question. Nothing further. I'd like that, if you'll have me. Christmas morning came in the particular hush of a heavy Wyoming snowfall, the whole yard gone white and untouched under a sky scrubbed clean and blue. Levi was up early, the fire already built by the time small feet came padding down the hall. Eli stood in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt, one sock on, clutching a battered wooden horse with most of its paint worn away. He studied Levi for a long moment with the flat, searching seriousness only a 4-year-old can manage. You're still here. I'm still here, Levi agreed. Eli considered this like it was a matter requiring real thought, then padded over and stood beside him at the window, barely tall enough to see over the sill. Toby says when the snow's deep enough you can build a fort. That's true. You can. Will you help? He looked up at Levi with the kind of open, undefended hope small children haven't yet learned to guard against disappointment. After breakfast, Eli nodded once, seriously, as though they had just concluded formal business, and climbed onto the bench to wait with his wooden horse set carefully in front of him. The weeks between Christmas and the New Year settled into something neither smooth nor easy but real, which Nella had learned a long time ago was the better thing to hope for. Levi did not know cattle, and he made no pretense otherwise, which she respected more than false confidence would have earned him. She taught him to sit a working horse properly, instead of a livery hack, to read a herd's mood before it turned, to mend a fence line so it would hold through a real Wyoming wind and not just a gentle one. He was clumsy at first, and never once complained about being clumsy, which revealed something about him that his letters never had. In exchange, he took over the ledger she had been keeping in the margins of feed receipts and the backs of old letters, straightened it into columns that finally made sense, and fixed the loose shutter on the east window without being asked, and started leaving a pot of coffee hot on the stove before she ever came in from the morning chores, though he never once mentioned having done it. Hazel came to trust him slowly, the way a child who has been managing grief for 2 years learns to trust anything, in small tested increments rather than declarations. Clara, watchful and quiet, began asking him to read to her from the one worn book of stories in the house, and he did, every evening, without making a performance of it. Bennett followed him everywhere with an endless stream of questions about Ohio and trains and whether a man could outrun a bear if the bear was small, and Levi met every single one with complete seriousness because he understood, without anyone telling him, that Bennett needed to be taken seriously more than he needed almost anything else. Eli simply stayed near him, the way small children attach themselves to whoever makes them feel safest, and brought him things, a pine cone, a flat stone, a tangled piece of string he was certain qualified as a knot, and Levi received each small gift with the gravity it deserved. Nella watched all of it from a careful distance she convinced herself was simple practicality. She caught herself, more than once, pausing in a doorway to watch him crouched at Eli's level, explaining something patiently, or bent over the ledger by lamplight long after the children were asleep, working figures with a focus she recognized because it matched her own. She had not expected to notice a man's hands, or the particular quiet way he listened before he spoke, or the fact that he never once tried to tell her how to run her own land. She had come here, in her own children's scheme, expecting nothing at all. What she had not bargained for was the plain, steady fact of him, and the growing, uncomfortable awareness that she was beginning, against every practical instinct she owned, to want him to stay for reasons that had nothing to do with the ledger or the fences. Trouble found them on a gray Thursday in the middle of January, in the shape of a well-dressed man climbing down from a hired wagon, while Nella was out on the range and Levi was home, minding the books and the younger children. Conrad Colton. He introduced himself, Frontier Trust and Land Company, out of Cheyenne. He'd come about the note on the Hart place, and he wanted it known plainly that the company would hate for Two Elk to go the way of the bishop spread 2 winters back. Foreclosed on quietly, quickly, the family gone by spring. He left without waiting for coffee, and Levi stood in the yard a long while after the wagon disappeared, turning the name Bishop spread over in his mind and not liking the shape of it at all. He met Nella at the door the moment she came in at noon, and watched something harden in her face that he was coming to recognize as the particular expression she wore when a problem needed handling rather than feeling. Get the ledger, all of it. Whatever Daniel left me holding, I want it laid out where I can see the whole shape of it. They worked it over 2 long evenings at the kitchen table after the children were asleep, going through every entry Daniel had ever made and every one Levi had straightened since. It was Levi, running a careful finger down a column of interest figures, who found it first. A compounding error in Colton's own paperwork. 3 months of interest calculated twice over, enough that the debt on paper ran higher than the debt actually owed. I kept books for 6 years at a dry goods store. A man learns to see a mistake in someone else's arithmetic before he trusts his own eyes on it. Nella looked at the figures for a long moment, then at him. My husband was never much good with numbers either. It was one more thing I ended up carrying alone. I know something about carrying things alone. Levi's voice stayed low. My aunt kept the books for the store the last few years of her life. I never had much of my own worth counting, so I got good at counting other people's instead. You've been alone a long time. It wasn't a question. Yes, there wasn't a better way to answer it, and it was true. The following Sunday, Hazel found her mother in the barn, mending a bridle by lantern light, and finally put the question she'd been working up to for weeks. Do you have feelings for him? She was direct the way she'd always been. I need to know, because I'm the one who brought him here, and if you end up hurt over what I did, I need to know that too. Nella set the bridle down. The night he arrived, he confessed he didn't know if he had anything left worth offering anyone. He was wrong about that, and I think some part of him is starting to know it. As for your question, yes, I have feelings. Whether they lead anywhere useful isn't something either of us gets to decide on a schedule. He brings the wood in before anyone's awake. Hazel's tone was carefully casual. Doesn't say a word about it, just does it. I know, I've noticed. What none of them had accounted for was the town itself. Coldwater Crossing was small enough that everyone's business belonged, sooner or later, to everyone. And a woman with an unmarried man living under her roof, no ring on her hand, and no announcement in the church bulletin, was a matter of considerable interest to people with little else to occupy a long winter. Nella heard it plainly one afternoon outside the mercantile, 2 women's voices carrying easily across the cold, wondering aloud whether the widow Hart knew exactly what she'd walked into, or simply didn't care how it looked. She stood very still on the boardwalk and let the words land, then carried them home and kept them to herself until the children were in bed. I heard some things in town today, Nella began, once the house had finally gone quiet that night. He listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finished, his jaw had gone tight in a way she was learning to read as shame directed inward rather than at her. That's on me. I should have thought harder about how my staying here would look, and done something proper about it sooner, instead of letting you carry the weight of it in front of the whole town. I'm going to speak with the Reverend, come spring, if you'll still have me by then. Spring felt very far away on a Thursday 4 days later, when a second letter arrived from Cheyenne, no longer a polite warning but a demand, the note now due in full within the week, not February as promised. The terms suddenly and deliberately moved up. Nella read it twice at the kitchen table and set it down with a hand that was not quite steady. Get your coat. Nella was already reaching for her own. We have 4 days, and I know exactly how we're going to use every one of them. The plan was simple to say and brutal to execute. The Army post 2 days hard ride north was buying beef for winter contract at a fair price, cash on delivery, and Nella had 40 head fit enough to make the drive if the weather held. It did not hold. The second morning out, with Toby riding drag and Levi working the flank on a horse he was only beginning to truly trust, A squall rolled down off the high country fast enough to catch them crossing the shallow ford at Sweetgrass Creek, ice skinned thin over water still moving underneath. A yearling steer went down through it, bawling, and a second panicked animal shoved past Levi's horse hard enough to put him into the freezing water up to his chest before he'd fully understood he was falling. Nella was off her own horse and into the current before she'd finished shouting his name, not because he needed rescuing from anything he couldn't have managed, but because two hands worked faster than one, and she had spent her whole life not waiting for permission. Together they hauled the steer clear and Levi clear, right behind it, both of them soaked through in air cold enough to turn wet wool to iron within minutes. Nella got a fire going with hands that would not stop shaking, got him out of the wet coat and into a dry blanket from the pack roll, and did not let go of his arm until the color started coming back into his face. "I did warn you I wasn't much good on a horse yet," Levi managed through chattering teeth. "You did fine. You stayed with the herd. That's the whole job." They made the post with 2 hours to spare on the fourth day, delivered 38 head at a fair winter price, and rode back into Coldwater Crossing to lay the proceeds and Levi's corrected figures on Conrad Colton's own desk together. He blustered for a while about company policy before he understood, watching Nella Hart set the compounding interest error down in front of him line by line in Levi's careful hand, that a mistake of that size made public in front of the Territorial Land Office would cost his company a great deal more than one Wyoming widow's note. The debt was settled that same afternoon, corrected and paid in full, and Nella Hart rode home in the last gray light of a January evening owning her own land outright, for the first time since Daniel died. Spring came slow to the high country that year, the way it always does, but it came. The Reverend rode out from Coldwater Crossing on a clear morning in April, and the wedding that followed was a small one, held in the yard between the mended porch rail and a wood pile that never again ran low. 5 children standing close in their best clothes, and not one of them looking even slightly surprised by how it had turned out. Hazel, 13, going on infinitely older, stood at the front, holding little Eli's hand, and allowed herself, for the first time in 2 years, to simply watch something good happen instead of managing it. I have shared a great many stories over the years, and I will say plainly that the ones which stay with me longest are never the ones about rescue. This was never that kind of story. Nella Hart did not need saving, not from the cold, not from the debt, not from a life that had already demanded more of her than any one person should reasonably have to give. What she needed, and what she finally let herself have, was somebody willing to stand in the hard, unglamorous middle of it beside her, mending fences, straightening ledgers, wading into freezing water when it mattered, staying quiet when quiet served best, and speaking plainly when it didn't. Home, it turns out, was never a place Nella Hart was waiting to find. It was a thing she had already built, plank by plank and winter by winter, with her own 2 hands. She had simply been missing someone with the courage to pick up a hammer and build alongside her. If this story found its way to you tonight, I hope it found you somewhere warm. I'm the voice behind Cowgirl Chronicles, and I'll be back soon with another true frontier heart to share. So settle in, and I'll see you next time.